I'm happy to be able to introduce Dr. Michael Webster. Michael is a professor of practice in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, where he focuses on the adaptation of reef systems to ongoing environmental change. His recent work is focused on reef building corals that are struggling to adjust to warming ocean temperatures and other challenges. Michael received his PhD in zoology from Oregon State University and his bachelor's in zoology from the University of Wisconsin. He has served as the executive director of the Coral Reef Alliance, where he has spearheaded efforts to improve management and conservation of coral reefs. And he has acted as program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, working with the conservation of salmon. He has held positions as a visiting research scientist at NYU, a visiting professor of practice at Cornell, and as a postdoctoral researcher at Oregon State. We are extremely fortunate to be able to host him here for the seminar, and I'll let him present his own work.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I've been visiting this building and people here for about 20 years now, and it's really been quite a while since I've been here last. And I can't tell you how nice it is to sort of walk into this building and see familiar faces and meet all sorts of new people asking interesting questions. So far, it's been fantastic to be here. So thank you for being such wonderful hosts. I'm going to talk today about a variety of different things. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is coral reefs, but to get us sort of into the meat of what I want to talk about, I want to just begin by telling you a little bit about me and how I got here, which I think is a somewhat unusual path. I started as a basic ecologist, and I was always interested in coral reefs. And I did my PhD work in the Bahamas predominantly, working on this fish here, which I realize now as it's blown up on the screen looks somewhat sinister. They're actually only little things that live on reefs. This is just a very close-up picture. But I studied these guys in the Caribbean, and I was interested in their population biology. I was interested in community ecology. And I got my PhD doing this, doing all sorts of interesting science, publishing the papers, doing everything I thought I was supposed to be doing to become an academic and become a professor. While I was doing this in the 1990s in the Bahamas, things started to change on these reefs. In particular, there was a big El Nino in the late 90s, and it caused a huge coral bleaching event on the reefs that I was working on. And giant coral heads that were probably hundreds of years old bleached and died that year, to the point where the reefs before and after were really fundamentally different. And this isn't the only point in my career that this happened, but this was something of a clarifying moment for me, where I started asking questions about the research I was doing, which was interesting and I enjoyed, and I was publishing papers and doing what I was supposed to be doing, and its sort of broader applicability. And I realized that these changes, this ecosystem that I cared a lot about, my research wasn't really helping to solve these problems. And so for me, it was one of these moments where I started asking myself, what do I want to spend my time doing in my career? And in particular, what's the best way for me and my particular skills and talents to try and make a difference for the kinds of organisms and ecosystems that I cared about? And I ended up making a really unusual decision as I was going into a postdoc at this time. And I took a position at a private foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And it was an unusual position because there was a group there working on salmon conservation in the North Pacific, and they were interested in questions around science and how scientific information could be used for conservation and management. And they ended up bringing me and their team to help build up a science portfolio within that project, which was one of the reasons I started visiting here more often, because there's lots of good salmon biologists and ecologists here. But the cool thing about this work was it gave me a chance to start to work at that interface between science and management and conservation. It wasn't just the more esoteric things that I had done as a graduate student. It was sort of thinking through how you can use this kind of information to do better at managing natural resources. Well, after about 8 years doing that work, I decided it was time for me to get back toward the ocean and get back in a salty environment, and if at all possible, start working back on the coral reefs that got me interested in science and conservation in the first place. And so I took another strange turn in my career, and I became an executive director of a conservation organization called the Coral Reef Alliance, who had a mission that was focused on how do you save coral reefs around the world. Now, I didn't know anything about being an executive director, and I had a pretty steep learning curve for the kinds of things that I had to do, but at least I was working back on the coral reefs that I loved. And as I started digging back into what was going on with coral reefs, I've been out of that game for about 10 years. The conservation situation was no better than when I had left it. And in a lot of ways, it was probably worse. And I started realizing, and this wasn't hard to figure out, but there was this potential sort of existential risk for coral reefs. There's this question of, are we really going to have coral reefs in the future because of how fast the world was changing and how much reefs were responding to that change in ways that many people would perceive to be negative? Now, there's all kinds of stats and statistics and studies that I could talk to give you a sense of what was going on these reefs. But I think some ways it's easier just to show it. So before I get to at least a few statistics, because I like a few, I want to show you what this looks like. So the reef here in this picture, which you can see it's a little washed out on the screen, but it's covered in corals of, 4 or 5 different species, but the bottom is totally covered with corals. This picture was taken in 1970 and was part of a research project in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. And the researchers were interested in things like coral succession after disturbance events. And they were using these big quadrats, and they did something in order to be able to put the quadrat back in exactly the same spot every time they visited the reef. They put this stainless steel pin, they drilled a hole in a coral head, they tapped it in so they could bring that quadrat back. Well, that's significant because somebody went back 40 years later and found that pin. So the next picture I'm going to show you is the same reef after 40 years of environmental change. So here's the pin. This is the same seam. What you can see is it looks completely different. I would argue this reef here, this is not a coral reef anymore. If you look in the background, you can find a few corals here and there, but for the most part, corals are pretty much functionally extinct in this system. It has shifted from a coral system to a different kind of system. Maybe the corals come back at some point, but most of the trajectory in the Caribbean is not toward significant recovery after things like this are happening. Now, we've got a lot of information about why this is happening, and unfortunately, it's actually a pretty long list. I won't cover all the reasons that this is happening, but some of them are things that are happening at local scales. There are things like overfishing, which is changing how the ecosystem works in ways that sometimes disfavor corals. There's coastal pollution that's doing similar kinds of things. There's habitat destruction in some places where people are just outright killing these organisms. In some cases, there's regional threats. There's diseases, particularly in the Caribbean, and that reef that I showed you has been heavily impacted by disease that spread through regions and have been causing high coral mortality. And then on top of this are a series of global threats. The one that's playing out most importantly today is around temperature increases, which is triggering bleaching like I saw in the 90s in the Bahamas. And then further down the road, we're probably going to have more and more problems from ocean acidification because these are calcifying organisms, makes it harder for them to build their skeletons. And when these things are lost from reefs, a lot of people can suffer with loss of various economic opportunities, whether they're related to fisheries or tourism or storm protection. There's a lot of people that are concerned about this problem, but the problem keeps advancing further and further. And I want to talk just a little bit about coral bleaching. Some of you have probably encountered this before. This series of photographs on the bottom shows you a bleaching event taking place over time on one reef. You can see in December 2014, that reef was looking just fine with those mustard colored corals. In the middle panel, the corals have bleached. Bleaching happens when corals, which form symbiotic relationship with a small alga that lives inside their clear bodies, when the relationship between the coral and the alga breaks down and the coral expels those algae in a last-ditch effort to survive, that's when the bleaching happens. The coral from the algae is now gone, and the corals, which are clear, you don't really see them in this photo. What you see is their white skeletons behind their clear bodies. So you're sort of seeing through the corals. This is an acute stress response, and it's most often triggered when ocean waters get warmer than average for an extended period of time. This is when corals do this. And then eventually, if it's a bad bleaching event, those corals can die. Sometimes they'll survive and take on new algae and recover. Oftentimes they die, and you get a reef like this one on the right, where that white skeleton has now been covered by other kinds of organisms, bacteria and algae. These corals are dead. This graph shows two things. Look at the red lines first. This is a timeline from 1980 to 2016, and the red lines show the number of bleaching events that have been observed globally. In 1980, it was just about 0. By the end of this time frame in 2016, if you look at bleaching events overall, it's more than 600. If you look at their definition of severe events, it's about 300. So it's gone from something that was very rare to something that's happening over and over again every year. The blue lines show the proportion of reefs that have never had a documented bleaching event. So in 1980, it was almost 100%. There were only a few reefs on the planet that were known to have bleached. By the end of this time frame, every reef on the planet was known to have bleached, most of them severely. And this is only 2016. It's only gotten worse since then. Some of the reefs that I've worked on in the Caribbean are at a point where they're bleaching almost every single year. And so here I was. I had left working at the foundation. I'd started working at this small conservation organization. I was getting back to working on coral reefs, and I was looking at what are we doing programmatically here? Well, my organization was largely doing community-based conservation, where we were working with local communities to try and figure out ways of structuring economic, cultural activities in a way that provided benefits to local communities, economic benefits or other benefits, but also did not necessarily undermine the reef. And usually this had something to do with managing fisheries in a different way or managing sources of coastal pollution in a different way. And it was looking for these sort of win-win situations where communities were on board and we could get benefits for both the community and the reef. Wonderful work. I find it really inspiring, and I really love this kind of work. And there's some evidence that if you do these kinds of things, you can actually make a better environment for the reef. You can't prevent bleaching, you can't prevent disease outbreaks, but in general, if you look at the literature on this, there's some evidence that you can get some demographic benefit when you do these kinds of things. Maybe you get a little better coral growth or a little better reproduction. Maybe you've got an environment that's a little bit better for larval corals, which drift in the ocean currents to arrive, set up shop, and represent the next generation of corals. So maybe you get a demographic benefit by doing these kinds of things. Awesome. But what I started wondering about is whether there's kind of a mismatch here and whether these kinds of local actions really are going to end up adding up to something that's going to be able to take on these global level patterns and these large scale changes on reefs. Is it really going to make a difference in the long run, or are we in a situation where these are good projects, they're providing benefit in the short and medium term, but in terms of the trajectory of coral reefs, are we really just rearranging our deck chairs on the Titanic here? And as somebody who was fundraising and trying to grow this organization, I felt this is a really important question that I needed to be able to answer or find an answer to in order to be able to do my job with a straight face. And as I started dug into it, I realized part of the core question here is it possible to save coral reefs? Not a question that people necessarily wanted to have answered because people wanted to believe, yes, we can, but that wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to know actually a little more. Can we do this? And if you start looking and say, well, what's the biggest problem here? You know, I'm trained as an ecologist. I want to look at this biologically and say, what's actually happening in this system? The issue is that the corals might not be able to adapt fast enough to keep up with the rate of change in their environment. We know corals can adapt to living in different conditions given enough time. We just look around the world and we can see that they've done this in the past. I'm not concerned about their absolute ability to do this. The question is, can they do it so quickly? And here, when I'm talking about adaptation to things like warming seas, I'm talking about this in both an ecological and an evolutionary context. And sorry if I'm offending any evolutionary biologists here, but for me, it does include that component of things like natural selection. It also includes ecological parameters like acclimatization or relocation or community reorganization or different levels of sort of demographic responses to changes in their environment. And so I wanted to find out, is there an answer to this question? Can corals adapt fast enough? So I went to the scientific literature. Where else would you go to find this answer? So I started reading papers. I started looking to see, okay, who can tell me whether this can happen fast enough? And I have to say, I came up kind of dry. There are hundreds, there are thousands of papers on coral reefs and on their conservation, but I couldn't find a good answer to this question. So I started thinking, okay, well, maybe it's the work is being done now, maybe it hasn't been published. So I started contacting my colleagues who were working on coral reefs and saying, hey, can you tell me, is there a good answer to this question? And they would sort of respond to me, they'd say, hey, that's a really good question. I'm like, yes, and they would say, listen, we don't really have a good answer to that. And part of the reason is it's a hard thing to measure. It's a hard thing to measure coral evolution because there's all these parameters and all these things we don't know and this and that. And it's not that they were wrong, but there was also, I think, a sort of a deeply held belief that corals probably weren't going to be very good at adapting, partly because they have long life cycles. And so if you can't get a lot of turnover in corals, you might just not be able to get enough generations to realistically see things like natural selection happening at the pace that the environment was changing. And so I think there was something of sort of like throwing up their hands and thinking maybe this just isn't going to work. But this idea was sort of largely untested. And not only was that untested, I had another question on top of this, okay, let's imagine for a moment it's possible to save coral reefs. If so, from a management or conservation perspective, what can we do to help that process along? That's really what I wanted to get at, because then I could use that to try and figure out how we would design our conservation organization in our work. So I started thinking back when I was doing this on some of the work that I had learned about from folks here about salmon, like the portfolio effects work in Bristol Bay that said, hey, listen, if you've got a really diverse portfolio, you can get more reliable returns of salmon. There's this sort of portfolio benefit of having a lot of diversity in the system. Well, hello, coral reefs have the highest diversity in the oceans, maybe the highest diversity on the planet. And that's high diversity, not just at the species level. There's a lot of within diversity, species diversity as well. And so I started thinking maybe there's something about this diversity portfolio that we've got that is actually going to make the difference for corals as they're adapting to environmental change. Let's take a look at that. And so I pulled together a group of smart people who think about things like this. And I said, hey, let's do a thought exercise. Let's imagine what would it take to design a conservation system for places like coral reefs that was designed to facilitate adaptation. What would that look like? And so we wrote this paper in 2017, and basically our argument was like this. It said, the best chance for successful adaptation is through some form of metapopulation management that protects a diverse portfolio of reefs in different habitats with different species and different genetic diversity, that within that network, there's larval connectivity so that individuals can move from one reef at least through cycles of reproduction, and that it's big enough so that it creates some sort of spatial risk against certain threats. And if you can build that kind of system, maybe that's the kind of system that you can imagine being good at facilitating adaptation. So we published that and thought, okay, let's call this thing an adaptation network. We've sort of described what we think maybe it might look like. What's the next step here? Well, we can't really realistically test these things in the kind of time frame that we might like implement and see the response, but we could use a modeling framework to try and figure out, well, at least based on what we know of coral biology and the changes that might be headed their way, is there a chance that this kind of system might work? So I expanded the sphere. We brought in more partners like Tim Essington here as part of this project and said, can we build a mathematical model of these systems that helps us at least look at different scenarios to try and get a sense of whether these kinds of systems might help with adaptation? And here's the big math figure. I'm not a modeler. I'm interested in this from the perspective of how do we get the information we need to make good decisions. There's lots of really cool modeling questions. I won't be able to help you with them to a great deal, but I can tell you the kinds of things we found and how we're using that to think about conservation. And so the first model that we put together, this was included basically three sort of species. It bucketed corals into two forms. One form was fast growing and tended to be more temperature sensitive. Another was slow growing, tended to be more temperature tolerant. Coral biologists think these represent sort of two pretty typical types of corals. And then the third species in the system was macroalgae, which would compete with corals for space. A pretty simple model, much simpler than a coral reef, but we thought it could capture some of the main dynamics about changes in who's occupying the space in the bottom of a reef. So the first paper on this was led by Tim Walsworth, who did this as part of his postdoc work here, and he's now at Utah State University. I want to just show you a little bit about the model that Tim built and that we worked with him on, as well as what some of those results are. Apologies if you've seen Tim's research before. So the first thing he did was he built a reef network. Now, this was a really simple reef network. It was basically 60 reefs in a row. I've represented that with these blue squares. It doesn't add up to 60, but that gets too busy. But the idea was that there was a chain of reefs and you could think of it across like a latitudinal gradient from an area that had relatively cool water to an area that had relatively warm water at the start of the modeling experiment. It also included larval connectivity, but only to nearest neighbors. So the assumption was that if there was reproduction, you could get sort of one generation at a time, you could move across reefs as sort of stepping stones. And then we were also interested in how's climate change going to play out in this system. So we modeled climate change over time. This model had a 3-degree temperature increase. It assumed that people started to mitigate climate change. We had about a 150-year time frame during which climate stabilized. This is something similar to RCP 6 predictions. All right, with the model in place, Tim started running 500-year simulations. The other key parameters in the model where this one is a really big deal, heritable genetic variance and thermal tolerance. This is basically a measure of if an individual has a phenotype that allows it to live at higher temperatures, how much of that phenotype is coded genetically and can be transferred to the next generation through sexual reproduction. That's a really important parameter. The next was looking at whether connectivity made a difference in the system. And the last piece was we designed the model to be able to look at different kinds of spatial management actions, particularly around marine protected areas, those places that we talked about earlier, where if you do good local management, maybe you get some demographic benefit for corals. And so you can, in the coral reef literature, there's a whole bunch of different ideas out there about how to design these spatial management systems. Some people will say, hey, your best reefs to protect are your cold reefs. Those are some sort of climate refugium. Those are the ones that your corals have the best chance for the future. So you should, if you're thinking about a network, emphasize the cold reefs. So those are shown in yellow here. There's another school of thought that says exactly the opposite. Go to the hot reefs. The hot reefs have the pre-adapted corals that are already good at living under high temperatures. Protect those ones. Those are the ones that are going to work really well for you. We don't know which one is better. We decided to also throw in a split the difference strategy, which said get some cold, get some hot. And one of the things we really wanted to test were diverse portfolio spatial management systems. This was part of the initial thinking that maybe it's something about diversity in the system that's going to help facilitate things like adaptation over time. So we looked at a whole bunch of scenarios more than this, and this just shows some proportion of the reefs. You can also say, well, what if you protect more of them? Or what if you protect fewer of them? What kind of results are you going to get? So it's a modeling world. You can test all sorts of different things within the model. So here's one of the results from that first paper. You've got genetic variance on the horizontal axis, starting with 0, so basically no opportunity for evolution, to higher and higher genetic variance. And on the vertical axis, you've got the proportion of coral cover. And what you can see is that there's sort of a break point in this particular scenario, whereby once you get to a certain level of genetic variance, the corals are basically able to keep up with environmental change so that at the end of the simulation, you've got relatively high coral cover. When genetic variance starts getting really low, that's when evolution just isn't happening fast enough and you're not keeping up with the pace of change. There's also 3 different levels of protected areas in this, from 0% protected, that's in the green, all the way up to protecting half of the reefs in the system where you're presumably getting that kind of demographic benefit. And what you can see is that under each of those protection scenarios, it's V that really determines here whether or not you're getting coral cover at the end, but then you get more the more you protect. This is the graph for when you've got connectivity among the different reefs. If you take away connectivity, if there's no larval transport, the picture gets a little grimmer. The shape is overall similar. Once you get to high enough genetic variance, essentially what you're doing is you're getting evolution on each reef separately. And so the reefs as individuals can keep pace. But having a connected system overall works better. So for coral adaptation in this modeled system, some genetic variance appears absolutely critical for corals. And we have reason to believe there's some out there, but this is one of those things that's hard to measure. One of our colleagues is setting up a bunch of studies to try and get better estimates of this right now. Connectivity helps, especially when there's low genetic variance, because it allows existing genotypes through sexual reproduction to basically spread throughout the system. And that adding more reef area helps in the system as well. We can actually look at the different management scenarios too, and look at how the spatial management scenarios play out in terms of their effectiveness. So this is a graph that looks at relative coral cover across a whole bunch of different management scenarios. The green ones on the top are all the diverse portfolio scenarios, and those ones tended to perform the best. The bottom 3 are the cold reef, hot reef, and split the difference scenarios, which tend to perform the least well. And then there's some in the middle that looked at the amount of coral cover. But the important thing is that when we looked at things like the diverse portfolio strategies, in the end, they actually made a pretty big difference to how much of a benefit you got, to the point where if you used a diverse portfolio strategy, you could get the same benefit by protecting 20% of the reefs as you would get by protecting 30% under one of the narrower like hot reef type strategies. So that there's something about how you choose your spatial management system that's giving you an added benefit for adaptation. All right, so that's one study. We've done a ton of these studies now, looking at it in different ways, looking at it with more realistic connectivity matrices, like mapping out the matrix around the Caribbean or the Western Pacific or the Coral Triangle, We've looked at different climate change scenarios. What happens if we don't mitigate climate? What happens if we do? We've looked at different levels of genetic variance. We've looked at different management interventions, a bunch of different ways to sort of slice and dice this same problem. And I would say that there's a sort of set of general conclusions that are coming out of these family of different models. One is that realistic level of connectivity is usually good for adaptation, but there's an asterisk here. Sometimes it's bad, especially if the flow of larvae coming in are from reefs that are producing larvae that are going to be maladapted locally. So if you've got the wrong larvae coming in, it can actually be a problem to have too much connectivity. Climate mitigation has an enormous result on the impact. The more we mitigate climate, the more likely corals are to persist, and the faster they are to adapt. Genetic variance, as we saw in that last study, even at pretty low levels, makes an enormous difference. If we factor in some level of evolution in the system, it really affects the outcome. And then finally, that we can design regional management strategies to try and optimize some of these effects and facilitate adaptation in the system. We also took this one step further and asked, okay, if that's what can happen with the existing genetic variance in the system and these existing networks, what happens if we try to actually actively boost evolution in this system through assisted evolution? So the idea here is if you imagine you've got a range of phenotypes of corals in terms of their ability to survive under different temperatures, if you can select out corals that are particularly good at living under high temperature, you can grow those out, you can transplant them out on the reef, you might be actually able to drive evolution toward higher thermotolerance in the system or tolerance for higher temperatures. You can do this by just finding maybe those organisms in the wild. You can also do it theoretically by doing selective breeding in tanks to try and create what coral people often call super corals that you might be able to transplant. So Lucas DiFilippo, who was also in this department, he's now at NOAA, he took on the task of trying to model what it would look like to do these kinds of augmentation. And he used a lot of the guts from that Walsworth paper to set up the modeling framework. And he looked at two different strategies here. I've talked about assisted evolution, where you deliberately put organisms that have higher ability to live at higher temperatures. In the coral world, there's also this thing called restoration, where people just are taking corals from the background and propagating them and putting them out. This is really just sort of some form of demographic rescue or demographic augmentation. It's not necessarily designed in a way that's doing anything other than bringing in sort of an average phenotype distribution. In this case, the corals that were being put out with higher temperature tolerances was a full 3 degrees Celsius. That's a big jump for corals. And this was assuming a pretty serious situation where we have climate warming of 5°C. And then we looked also at different spatial management strategies of where do you put the corals in the system. So this paper just came out last year, led by Lucas. And take a look at the graph on the upper right. There's 3 panels here for 3 different spatial strategies of where to put things out in the environments you've grown in the lab. Vertical axis is, again, mean coral cover. And then that horizontal axis is stocking level. And it's a proportion of the area that you're managing. So how much of the reef are you going to be stocking with these corals that you're growing in captivity? And so 0 means you're not doing any of this activity. You can get all the way up to 0.0001% of, well, I guess that's 0.01% of the environment out there. Oh my God, you can't see the light green dots at all on this screen. All right, so there's some light green dots that sit on the bottom, and that's demographic restoration. Basically, the demographic restoration doesn't work until you get to extremely high levels. And essentially what you're doing is, after climate stabilizes, you're putting so many individuals out there that you're just hastening the return of the population. But that's really the only thing it does. If you put out the corals that are adapted to living at higher temperatures, though, you can start to get effects at lower stocking levels. And so you can see here these green dots sit at the bottom for a while, and then they jump up. And basically what that's saying is that in that scenario, there were enough of these individuals put in that system that they basically kick-started the evolutionary process for corals and allowed them to recover in that system faster. So it looks like it's at least theoretically possible to do this, particularly at high restoration levels. And it's important to note that this restoration had to happen for at least a century to give these kinds of results. This was not a one-time intervention. This was a year after year after year, keep doing this intervention in the model. So it looks like it could theoretically work. There are some significant drawbacks, though. One is it's expensive to do this every year for a century. 2 is that Coral cover, even if you do this, drops to near zero at sort of the worst of climate change as the environment is changing really quickly. So it doesn't save coral reefs in the near term, it helps bring them back as climate stabilizes. And the benefits may not be realized for hundreds of years. So it's a hard sell for management. It's also really important to know that these thermal extremophiles, they are not available right now. So we don't have a stock of these corals. They would have to be found, developed, et cetera, even to be able to pursue this strategy. And then the last piece I just want to note is that this is just for thermal extremophiles. This is just the ability to survive at higher temperatures. As we talked about earlier, there's a lot of changes going on for coral reefs, and it could be that we design the best coral in the world for surviving at high temperature, but maybe it's more susceptible to disease or pollution or one of those other threats. And so this is really only one dimension of the potential problem for corals. But I'd say overall, this may be a complementary strategy to things like the adaptation networks we talked about earlier. All right, so I started this part of the talk posing sort of this big picture question of, is it possible to save coral reefs? And I don't claim to have the answer to that, but we have tried to look at this in many different ways. And I think at least within the context of those models, it looks like, yeah, this is probably at least possible. Well, that's good news if you're running a coral reef conservation organization. It argues that, yes, you have something to work toward. That was good. But I think it's also clear that there are a lot of things we would have to do for this to work. So that second question of, is there anything we can do in management and conservation to facilitate this adaptation? The answer is like a really loud yes. And the first thing is global action on climate change, right? If we can begin to mitigate climate change, we're going to create a lot more space for corals to have a chance to adapt. That's really the biggest one and the headline. But even if we do that, the environment's going to keep changing, and it's going to keep changing for many decades to come. The corals are going to have to adapt even if we solve climate change. And I think what we can argue in this case is that things like those adaptation networks that we now have a little bit better idea, at least how to theoretically design, those kinds of things can help facilitate that adaptation during that period of time. And we may have other tools come online, things like assisted evolution, that maybe are part of that solution set, but probably complementary to all of that genetic diversity that's out there right now with the corals that are in the system that may be able to move through that process of adaptation over time. So that's sobering, but it's also somewhat optimistic because it argues there are things we can do. And so while I was at the Coral Reef Alliance, we started designing our conservation interventions to match this notion of adaptation networks. And so, for example, we worked in the Mesoamerican region. This is Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. This is an area with extensive coral reefs. And when we were looking at this region, one of the things that you might notice is that the managed areas in that system are heavily in Mexico and Belize, that there'd been a lot of work to create different kinds of management areas there, which, great. Those are the kinds of places where maybe we'll be able to get some of those demographic benefits. But one of our observations is, well, what about all these reefs in Honduras? And so one of the things that we did was we said, we're going to really emphasize trying to increase the local management activities in Honduras and work with many different communities across this country to build out a better network. And the idea here was that we were building out this sort of regional adaptation network that by including those southern reefs as well as those northern reefs, you're going to get more overall diversity in the system, you're going to get more connectivity, and you're going to get that larger spatial scale for mitigating risks that are moving through that system. And so here was sort of the connection that I was wondering about earlier between, is there a possible connection here between this kind of local scale work that is trying to provide those short and medium term benefits to communities and this sort of larger vision of, is there a way we can try and save coral reefs? And the conclusion that I came to based on this work is, yes, they actually fit together rather neatly, so long as you're thinking about that local scale work, not only in the context of how it's playing out locally and how those benefits are apportioned, but if you're also thinking it in the context of these bigger network systems that include many local conservation initiatives. Okay, so I did this work at Coral Reef Alliance for a long time. The science work was done with lots of different partners here and elsewhere. I came away from that work cautiously optimistic that at least we had a game plan for how to move forward on coral reefs. But I did note that we had to do a lot of sort of making this up as we went along and trying to figure out answers to these questions, which are kind of fundamental to how we do conservation in this system. And as I was doing this work, I started wondering, how are other people in other systems dealing with questions like this? It's not like corals are unique in that they're facing new threats and that they're changing in our changing world. How are other species adapting to these kinds of changes? And how can people more generally work to facilitate these kinds of processes? So I started looking across a series of sort of case studies of different species and different ecosystems with sort of these sets of questions in mind. And this was in the context of what, I think we might all agree, there's a biodiversity crisis on our planet where it's not just about coral reefs, that we've got rapid environmental changes that are changing our extinction rate. And the people who have tried to estimate these things have come up with estimates along the lines of extinction rates are about 1,000 times what they were prior to sort of the rise of people in the Anthropocene. So 1,000 times above background rate, and they may go up an order of magnitude more before we're done. And so there's this question in conservation more broadly and this concern about losing Earth's biodiversity and this question of, are we in a position where we're going to be losing a large fraction of Earth's biodiversity? And this is sort of popularized by the concept of the sixth extinction. Are we entering a sixth extinction event? And so as I started looking at these different case studies, I noticed sort of two patterns starting to emerge. One was that some species actually seem to be adapting just fine on their own. Well, that's good news. And the mechanisms that they were using to do that, if you sort of strip down the biology and ask what's happening, are the same kinds of things that were present in those models for corals. There was demographic rescue, and there was evolutionary rescue, and there were density-dependent population responses to disturbances, that these things are coming on in nature as the environment changes. And for some species, so far, they're actually proving to be enough. And then there's this other set of species for which, without some pretty dramatic interventions, we stand to lose them in the relatively near future. And these are the kinds of species, like tigers, or this is a mountain pygmy possum in Australia that's likely to go extinct due to climate change, unless we choose to intervene on their behalf. And so I started organizing this thinking and this set of case studies into a book that just came out last October called The Rescue Effect, where the rescue effect is this sort of concept about the inherent tendency in nature to help organisms and populations and species persist when their environment changes. This is the guts of those models for coral. When you looked at those models and there were no interventions and the corals still were able to respond, these are the kinds of things that were happening in the model to help the corals, at least the modeled corals, adapt to a changing environment. And as I started breaking it down, to me, I found what I think are 6 different components to this in biology. You might be able to slice and dice these things differently. You might maybe come up with other ones I haven't thought of. I'd love to hear that. But the sort of these 6 tendencies in nature, as I define them, were demographic rescue, which we definitely saw going on in the corals, genetic rescue, especially at small population sizes, maybe not as much in those models. Evolutionary rescue was happening all over the place in those models as the environment was changing. Things like density-dependent population growth, when population size gets small, particularly that exponential growth. Climatization, which operates at the individual level, but it's built into those models around the range of parameters that a given coral can survive in. And relocation, which is something that's coming up over and over again in conservation right now, which is species are, in some cases, finding themselves in places where the environment is less and less suitable for them. And we're starting to see lots of range shifts happening in nature. And so the rescue effect concept, which I borrowed from a 1970s paper on demographic rescue, I used to sort of describe this overall tendency in nature to help things persist and help them adjust as their environment is changing. But as I mentioned before, the rescue effect is not all powerful. And we have opportunities, including some really exciting new opportunities to consider about different ways to try and boost these processes in nature. And if you think about classical management and conservation, oftentimes it was focused on things like reducing acute threats to species or ecosystems, or augmenting wild populations, or restoring ecosystems. And those are all still good and valid ideas. But if you start looking at what's happening in conservation as people are realizing the scope of change and the dire situation that's creating for some species or some ecosystems, people are starting to consider all sorts of different new tools or practices that they might apply. One is things like the adaptation networks that we're talking about in corals. Can we design systems to facilitate adaptation over time? There's also selective breeding already going on in corals to try and develop new forms that maybe are better at surviving at higher temperatures. And you can see the selective breeding showing up in other systems. One of the ones I looked at in the book was the American chestnut, where people have been trying to breed a disease-resistant American chestnut for more than 100 years, and this species was decimated by an introduced fungal pathogen. They've also been hybridizing this species with another species of chestnut to see if they can create this sort of hybrid organism that has disease resistance as well. And in this one, they're even genetically engineering American chestnut to what I believe is the very first conservation-oriented GMO. And I haven't checked in the last few weeks, but they're awaiting permission to begin growing these genetically modified American chestnut trees more broadly. And then species relocation on top of it, some species are not going to be able to survive where they are, and they're probably not going to be able to get someplace new, which is putting us in this sometimes uncomfortable position of having to decide, are we going to deliberately move things from one place to another and see what happens? And then finally, there's even a movement in conservation to try and bring back things that have gone extinct, or at least bring back facsimiles of things that are similar to the species that went extinct. And so there's, I think, a lot of innovation going on in conservation right now, which is exciting. It's also sobering because some of these tools are controversial for good reason. And we're in a position where, as we're thinking about how species and ecosystems are going to adjust, we're going to have to make a lot of new kinds of trade-off and values decisions. So those are just some anecdotes. Those give sort of a flavor of what's out there. There's nothing scientific or comprehensive about that. It's hard to get comprehensive data on what's going on with species. And one of the questions I looked at while I was researching the book was, well, how bad has it gotten for species out there? Like, how many species do we know of that are currently at a point where they're at heightened risk of extinction? Essentially, how far down the road of the sixth extinction have we gone so far? And while these data are imperfect, there are at least some data on the topic. So one way to look at that is to say, well, how many species are out there? Well, we know that there's at least 2 million. That's about how many we've described. We know there's more that we haven't described, but let's look at the 2 million that we have described. If we look at those species, we can go to the world's best database on threatened species, which is the IUCN Red List. And the Red List documents species that are known to be at higher risk of extinction. Right now, that's about 1.9% of species. Looks like a small percentage here, but keep in mind, this is 40,000 species on the planet. There's a lot in that bucket. If we look at their category of most at risk, critically endangered, that's about 0.4%. And if we look at known extinctions, and this includes extinct in the wild for things that are still in captivity, it's about 0.05%. Now, there are all kinds of problems with these data. They're all underestimates. We know there's more species, and we know that only a small fraction of species have been assessed. There's probably a bias toward assessing those species that we think are at the most risk, but as more assessments happen, we're going to find more species that are at risk. We also know that there's a lot of trajectories here that are driving more species to extinction risk. So we have every reason to believe that these red bars here are going to go up as we have better data and as time moves on. But I do want to point out that these numbers are kind of low right now. They're lower than I expected them to be when I started looking at these data. And I started asking myself, well, what is actually going on here? Why do we have a relatively small fraction of species right now that, given all the changes we've done to things like land use and harvest and introduced species and now climate on top of it, why do we have a relatively low proportion here? And I think the answer is actually the rescue effect. That these mechanisms in nature that respond to environmental change are kicking on for species all over the world. And for most species so far, in as much as we've looked, they're working. They won't work forever, but they're working right now. And so I wanted to conclude with just a few thoughts that going through all this research and looking at all these different case studies and different examples, I tried to divine, I think, are there any sort of broader messages to think about in conservation in the Anthropocene? And I boiled it down to 3 sort of bullet points. The first one is the biggest no-brainer in the world, and that's we need to slow the rate of change. All of these responses by organisms are limited in how far they can go and how fast they can go. And if there's one thing we can do to help organisms adapt, it's going to be slowing the rate of change, particularly the rate of climate change. So no surprise on that one, but I think fundamentally this is the biggest thing we can do to help life adapt. But when we know that there's problems, I think we can use frameworks like the rescue effect to help us figure out what we can do. And I think we're at a point in conservation where we need to be asking ourselves hard questions about potentially using methodologies that maybe we wouldn't have been comfortable with in the past. If we really are trying to do things like make sure that species stick around, there's a lot of new tools coming online. And these are some of the things we've already talked about, things like species relocation and selective breeding, and genetic engineering, even de-extinction if it ever gets proven to be successful. And so I think what we can do is we can look to these processes that are happening already in nature and ask ourselves, should we and can we deliberately boost those processes to help things like species make it through the bottleneck that we're creating for them around climate? And then the last piece is something I haven't really talked about so far, and that is celebrating novelty. So I've been working in science and conservation for a long time, and I think back to when I first got into this field. A lot of the focus was about how do you keep nature from changing? How do you hold an ecosystem in the same state? How do you put a park in a place and have it not shift over time by minimizing threats, minimizing changes to that ecosystem? And if you are unable to do that, how do you pull something back to the state where it used to be through tools like restoration? And at its core here was this sort of implicit and explicit values judgment that there was a right way for nature to be. And it probably was some historical model that we saw at some time in the past. And that was our model for what we were aiming for. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's probably impractical in the world that we've created, where we know that everything is changing in ecosystems. And I think what we're going to have to get more comfortable with in conservation is with understanding that change and at times embracing, even facilitating that change in order to get the things we want out of ecosystems that we value. We know that all ecosystems are going to look different in the future. We've got lots of species moving around the world, either moved by us or moving on their own. We've got things like shifts in age distributions. We see it a lot on corals, or we have systems that no longer have, maybe never had, stable equilibria in them. We've got changes to genetic structure in populations. And all of those things, I would argue, are actually signs that the rescue effect is working in nature. It may not always get us to the outcome that we want, but it is a sign that nature is adapting and adjusting to the changes around us. And just to give you a quick example, this colorful, crazy coral reef right here, this is a picture I took in Cozumel last year. This was an amazing system, unlike any I'd ever seen. I jumped into my first dive in Cozumel, and I was like, what is this system I'm looking at? It was mind-blowing because it was not a coral reef anymore. The corals in this system, and some reefs were down, certainly under 5% cover. It wasn't a coral system. It had become a sponge system. All this color here are different species of sponges that were growing and creating all this structure in the system. And as somebody who values coral reefs, my initial reaction was, this is terrible. But then as I looked at it, I'm like, well, I would rather it be a coral system, but look at all the species that are doing just fine here. And look at all the people who are dependent on the system. There were 100 dive boats out on this reef every single day with super happy divers coming back from their dive saying, did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see that? And so while I might have this normalized view that says corals are better than sponges, they didn't have that. People were making money off this system. The system was functioning. It had adapted to be a completely different kind of system. And so I think it's useful to sort of check our assumptions when we come into a situation like that and ask ourselves, well, maybe I would prefer this to be a coral-dominated system, but maybe the fact that it has arrived at this completely different state that's providing all these different values, maybe that's cool too. Maybe there's something about novelty here that's actually a sign that nature is good at adapting, and maybe it's not necessarily bad. So just to close, amid what I think is realistically a biodiversity crisis, there is at least a little bit of good news. There's a robust set of biological processes that are helping to rescue organisms and populations and species, and these things are all being triggered automatically, which is awesome. And we are not yet locked into a future where we lose a large fraction of the species on the planet. Most of them are still out there, and that means that we have agency here. We have time to act on behalf of the ones that are most at risk. And we've got an increasingly powerful toolkit to help those that have gotten to the point where we have to extend great effort to bring them back. This is not a perfect world. It doesn't mean we don't have to work, but it means that things have not progressed to the point where we have lost this. We have a lot of opportunity. We have a lot of agency to decide what the future of life looks like on the planet. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Although it's only the 1.9 and when it's endangered, like a lot of the remaining percent hasn't been assessed with so.
Yeah, and you can look at groups that have been well assessed, like mammals that are well assessed, and there are. So you can get really high values for it, and then you have to ask if are mammals representative of typical group of species or if it's something special about mammals. I think you can argue with this. There's no question that more of the sex than more of this. So I understand what you're making. I think it's valid. The overall proportion of the set is relatively low, but I think that the assessments have also probably been chosen fairly deliberately for the things that.
So thank you very much for the talk. It was really cool having a positive outlook. I really liked it. One thing I was wondering is in your current study, you actually showed the importance of genetic variability within species, right? And in all of this rescue effect, it appears to me a role the genetic variability within species. Right? So, for example, captive breeding would have role genetic variability within species. Population extinction rates are much higher than species extinction rates. So they would have role genetic diversity. Range shifts or we have genetic diversity. So all these rescue effects are really eroding exactly what they are for that.
And I think this is a big concern, right? Because right now when we think about evolution, it's mostly for understanding the person. It's not a new mutation. And so there's I think you're right, there's an extreme value to the existing person. I think a lot of tools that we think about education are about how you actually try to retain and boost some of that genetic diversity. So that was when you're working in corals doing cryopreservation. And basically, listen, we're going to lose these things, but we can store them in liquid nitrogen and maybe thaw them out later, and then we'll have more genetic diversity to work with. Some of the people who are working on restoration are starting to think about not picking super corals and not picking random corals, like how do you bring in actually a more diverse population? So maybe you can source corals from different places where there is some spatial genetic structure, put them in one place and hope that within that place you provide some genetic variance extending out. So I think you're exactly right. And obviously, if you've got genetic rescue going in the system, the assumption is you're losing genetic diversity that have so much selection for certain traits. And so you're right that there is a risk of losing genetic diversity in the system. One of the patterns that came out that I thought was really interesting in some of these places are some of the, both in nature as well as by people, efforts to increase genetic diversity through things like hybridization. So one of the chapters I wrote was on the later cichlids, which have arguably gone through the biggest murder extinction that I've watched. On the other side of that, the cichlids are largely recovered in abundance, but with something like 200 fewer species, there's a big loss. But some of the species that are there, like people are working on this, but that's not quite the same species that was there before, in this case, for gene reduction. And when they start looking at it genetically, they're seeing it's actually the result of intercropping 2 or 3 different species. And what seems to be happening is that some of the more specialized species in the past are intergressing, and they're actually doing really well. And so this may actually be adaptive intercropping, where they increase the level of genetic diversity in species by bringing a few species together to create something new that sort of has more genetic options. So that's an interesting one. And obviously things like American chestnut, the crossing of American chestnut and Chinese chestnut is a very explicitly to try and bring new genetic diversity into that species. Same thing with the genetic engineering that said, okay, we can see this kind of genetic tool for finding diseases in other species. We can plot that out of that species and insert it. Yeah, but I think your point is fair. Yeah, please.
So going back to your on the modeling for management, you point out that there was 2 key parameters to look at: genetic variance and connectivity between reefs. I was wondering how closely should we manage the floral and MPAs to set up that connectivity, and how much of that is already in?
We've had some debates about this internally within our team as well. those MPA benefits, I mean, overall, in the modeling framework, they look real. Provided we're right about the demographic. We model the demographic benefit to looking at this, and there's been some controversy about that in the field. But the protecting more and more reef doesn't get you a fundamentally different answer in terms of how the scenarios play out. If the corals are going to keep up with adaptation, it's actually more driven by experience. And what happens with the local protections is it's like a little boost. Essentially, it's mostly a demographic boost. You've got more places where there's more coral. Even though that's an evolutionary process, but largely what you do is create places that have some density force. Did I answer your question? Back there.
Yeah, you spoke a bit about like genetic engineering and like breeding corals together to select for grades. I'm wondering like what drawbacks there are for doing that, like accidentally selecting for grades that could like.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is not something I do. I've never done that kind of work, but I think one of the risks that I worry about most in Adelina is selecting for the wrong traits or selecting for too narrow a set of traits, right? Like, picking really great thermal extreme files that are terrible. And if there are trade-offs genetically between those different traits, you can wind up in a situation where you have things that are actually not very well suited. The other kinds of problems. Right?
My understanding is that if you go back thousands of years, we've seen periods that are as warm as today, perhaps not warming as quickly as today. What do we know about the paleohistory of coral reefs in terms of reaching in the past the periods of warming?
I don't know that we've got a paleo record of bleaching per se. We do have paleo records that show coral reefs do fluctuate over time. And we do know that during like global extinction events, when the environment changes quickly, coral reefs sometimes disappear from the planet for 1 million years or longer before coming back. So the consequences of that can be quite high, but I don't think I know enough to be able to answer your question intelligently.
We take one more question, and I'm commanded to take everybody to beer by Commissioner Timber.
That sounds good to me.
Can I ask you a cynical question?
Please. I have my cynical days too.
The rescue effect, just looking at the positive for the successful component of natural selection. If you take a step back, isn't this just natural selection in action that survives? And does that mean that your next book is going to be called the Extinction Effect? Looking at those that are not successful.
Yeah, I mean, listen, ultimately, as I've defined it, how the rescue effect come to be? It came to be because organisms that weren't able to do these things have disappeared in the past, right? The species that we see on the planet today come from those lineages that have successfully figured out how to deal with environmental change in the past. So these mechanisms have arisen through things like natural selection. Sure, absolutely. And they're also not all powerful, as we've seen with things that have gone extinct already or things that are getting closer and closer to extinction. They can be surpassed by things like, amounts of change that are too high or too fast. Sure, it's entirely possible to outstrip the ability of organisms to adapt on their own. Right now, we're seeing that, if you believe the IUCN numbers for 40,000 or more species on the planet are now in a situation where there's arguably this set of parameters is not strong enough. And then real numbers probably bigger, although there's probably things on that list that aren't famous and dangerous and things that the list implies as well. So it makes sense. But I think there's plenty of species correlations having improved. Okay, thank you very much.